the killing of innocent people based on a twisted ideology is an attack not just on France, not just on Turkey, but it's an attack on the civilized world.
President Obama reaffirming U.S. resolve in waging the war against ISIS. And it's time now for our Sunday group. Syndicated columnist George Will, Peter Baker, who covers the White House for the New York Times, radio talk show host Laura Ingraham, and Charles Lane from the Washington Post. Peter, we had seen something of an escalation in U.S. efforts against ISIS just in the last week, with American airstrikes helping the Kurds take back the city of Sinjar and also cut the highway, vital highway linking the ISIS capital of Raqqa in Syria with their biggest city in Iraq, Mosul, and then also the strike that apparently took out Jihadi John. In the wake of the attack on Paris, what do you expect President Obama to do now?
Well, it's a very good question, because in fact he said, just as you pointed out earlier in the program just a couple of days ago, that ISIS was contained in Iraq and Syria. I think he meant territorially in there, but clearly, you know, Paris and now the Russian plane and Beirut suggest something otherwise. Just yesterday, they had a strike in Libya, first time they attacked an ISIS target outside of Iraq and Syria. And so you already began to see the beginning of perhaps a new stage of the effort. But you know, he's going to have to confront this issue of what more he's willing to do. I don't think he's going to be willing to put in substantial numbers of ground troops, as Ben Rhodes told you earlier in the program, and he's going to find that the options within the parameters he's willing to consider are relatively narrow.
You know, I want to pick up on that, Laura, because President Hollande said this was an act of war. He said that the French response will be merciless. There's talk about France invoking Article 5 of NATO. An attack against one nation is an attack against all. And yet what struck me when I raised all of that with Ben Rhodes, the president's deputy national security advisor and a very close aide to him, don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah, it is interesting that the tonality of the French leadership is much stronger and much more aggressive sounding, obviously in the aftermath of this horrific series of attacks, seems more aggressive than our own president. I think there are a lot of things that come into play here. And you said earlier that immigration to Ben Carson isn't really connected to this. But I think as you're seeing with what's happening on the ground in France and Switzerland with the rise of the Nationalist Party there, the real push against Merkel today in Germany for her saying a couple of days ago that my vision is intact for taking in these refugees. I think immigration actually is going to be part of this discussion.
And what's interesting there is, again, I asked Ben Rhodes about that, particularly given the fact that one of these attackers apparently was a migrant, had a Syrian passport. He said, no, we're going to continue with that program too.
And hundreds, I understand, arrived yesterday in New Orleans, Syrian refugees. They're already coming to this country. And I think this is going to become a big part of this presidential debate, more so than it already is. And it really directly does tie into national security, our southern border, our northern border, our visa program, and now with the refugees coming in, at least one was part of the migrant program, registered, went through the whole process. The island of Leros moved forward through Macedonia and made his way to a connection in Paris that was helping carry out these series of attacks.
Chuck, if this does, and everybody seems to assume that this is ISIS, as I was discussing with Ben Rhodes and discussing with General Keane, they seem to be engaged, or if they had aspirations before, they seem to be realizing them now, international terrorism, the downing of the Russian airliner, the suicide attack in Beirut, this horrific attack in Paris. And I'm wondering, is there a disconnect between President Obama and his people saying, well, we took back the city of Sinjar 17 months later, and what the carnage that ISIS is involved in now?
Well, I think we are witnessing in effect, from ISIS's point of view, the retaliation to what the U.S. and France have been attempting to do so far. In other and others, they're fighting Hezbollah, so they attack the Hezbollah area of Beirut. This is their effort to carry the fight that we have been taking against them into our cities and our heartland, and to impose a cost on our civilian populations of the so far limited measures that we've taken in their region.
But I was going to say, then doesn't the kind of, quote, containment that the president talks about, isn't that missing the point?
Well, they are trying to show that it's futile. In other words, we can't be contained. Yes, maybe you can knock 25 miles off our territory somewhere, but we can reach out and touch you right in the heart of your capital. And that's why this is so dangerous, because it is an attempt by them to show that, no, you can't fight this by remote control, right? You can't fight this through limited means. If you want to fight us at all, it's got to be total war.
George.
It's possible, I think, that looking back a few weeks from now at this particular demonstration, that what happens in Syria doesn't stay in Syria. We're going to conclude that in a grim sense, worse is better. In this sense, for years now, the war on terror has been enveloped in the strategic, tactical, legal, and moral ambiguities of dealing with what are called non-state actors. Well, here we're dealing with something that has state in its title, that increasingly, by demonstrating its reach far from its territory into Libya and into France and knocking down airlines, acts like a state, and it should be treated like a state. If I heard Ben Rhodes correctly, he said that it is up to France whether or not to call this an Article 5 event. In NATO's 66 years, only once has the territory of a NATO member been invaded. That was the Falkland Islands, a long way from the North Atlantic. But Mr. Putin clearly is watching this. If you believe, as I do, that Putin's aim ultimately is to destroy NATO by having a kind of semi-Article 5 infraction in the Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia, he's watching this with those cold eyes of his, saying, what are they going to do if France does this? It'd be interesting to know if there's pressure on France not to invoke that article.
Yes. Remember the one time they did
The
it was after
Islamic
9/11.
State wants to destroy NATO too. This is a weaponization, in a way, of all the fragilities of the alliance up within Europe and between Europe and the United States.
I want to turn,
the
excuse
EU.
me, guys, to the political issue, because it seems to me this has enormous political ramifications. As you heard, Peter, in my discussion with Dr. Ben Carson, maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong, but it feels to me like we're going to be entering a new chapter of this presidential race now, where national security, foreign policy, the war on terror is going to become a much more central issue in the campaign than it has been. Here was Hillary Clinton talking about the attack on Paris in last night's Democratic debate.
I think what the president has consistently said, which I agree with, is that we will support those who take the fight to ISIS. But this cannot be an American fight, although American leadership is essential.
Question, do you think this helps or hurts Clinton, given Obama's foreign policy record? And what do you think it does to the Republican race, where you have the office holders with some experience and the outsiders who have held sway up till now?
Yeah. Well, look, she said last night that ISIS can't be contained, it needs to be defeated. So there she's already trying to, in fact, distance herself to some extent from the president's foreign policy. She comes across, obviously, more than her counterparts on that particular stage as fluid and comfortable with foreign policy issues, given her experience. That's not surprising. Bernie Sanders starts his opening statement by addressing Paris and then very, very quickly shifting to the ground he is comfortable on, which is income inequality, and trying to move this debate away. But if you're president, you have to deal with all these different things. You can't simply brush away a foreign policy issue. The biggest challenge for her, though, which he made, is that, you know, he blames her in effect, and by extension George W. Bush, for invading Iraq in the first place with a Democratic audience. That's still a salient point to make. He doesn't give an alternative what he would do today, given the situation as it exists.
Laura, let's turn to the Republicans. What do you think this does to that race?
A couple of things. I think credibility and resolve become ever more important. I think experience as well, no doubt about it, in dealing with this type of crisis, a threat to one of our strongest allies, and perhaps to the United States, given our own porous borders. Chris Christie spoke yesterday at the Sunshine State event in Florida. He played out a whole speech, kind of throwing out a stump speech and focusing on these issues of credibility, resolve, someone in office who does not just blow with whatever political winds are there and puts America's interests first and that of her allies. It was a very powerful speech. I think we'll see more of that from other candidates.
George, just 30 seconds left on this. Is foreign policy going to be an area of strength or weakness for Hillary Clinton, given all the criticism of the Obama foreign policy?
It seems to me the more disorderly the world is, the more difficult it is to run on your record as Secretary of State as a qualification for president.
To be continued. Thank you, panel. See you next Sunday.